Science can now do something that, throughout human history, existed only in nightmares or fantasies. Not in 50 years. Right now. In real labs, with real money, with real results that no one is discussing in the headlines. And while the world debates other things, a handful of scientists are about to cross a line that no previous civilization could cross, bringing the dead back to life. But no one is asking the right question, not whether it can be done. That already has an answer. The question is, what happens next? Today we're going to look at the animals that are already in the process of being brought back, why it could go worse than you imagine, and finally, the case that no scientist should ever have proposed. When we get there, you'll understand why I left it for last. Part 1. Those who are already on their way. There are a very specific number of animals for which there is, at this moment, an active scientific de-extinction project. Not theories, not speculative papers. Projects with funding, with teams, with deadlines. And that number is higher than you think. Let's start with the most famous. The woolly mammoth disappeared about 4,000 years ago, after surviving entire ice ages. It wasn't killed by an asteroid. We killed it. Human hunting and the climate change at the end of the Pleistocene wiped out one of the most resilient animals that ever lived on Earth. For thousands of years, it lay frozen in the Siberian permafrost, perfectly preserved, waiting. And in 2021, a company called Colossal Biosciences received $15 million to bring it back. The plan isn't exactly to clone a mammoth. It's something stranger. You see, Colossal is taking DNA from the Asian elephant, the mammoth's closest living relative, with whom it shares over 99% of its genome, and inserting the genetic variants that made the mammoth what it was: long hair, subcutaneous fat, and tolerance to extreme cold. What they're going to create is technically a hybrid, an animal with the body of an elephant and the characteristics of a mammoth. The internal target date for the first viable embryos is around 2028, not 2100, 2028. The scientific justification isn't just for show. Colossal's argument is ecological. Mammoths trampled the Arctic snow in winter, exposing the permafrost to the cold and keeping it frozen. Without mammoths, the permafrost thaws faster and releases enormous amounts of methane, accelerating climate change. The mammoth as a climate tool. Sounds brilliant. We'll come back to that point later, because there's something buried in that argument that almost no one has noticed. The second animal is less well known in Europe, but in Australia, it's almost mythical. The thylacine, also called the Tasmanian tiger, or marsupial wolf, was the largest carnivorous marsupial in the modern world. It had a jaw that opened almost 90 degrees, tiger-like stripes on a dog-like body, and a pouch like a kangaroo's. A creature that seemed designed by someone who wanted to test the limits of what an animal could be. In 1936, at the Hobart Zoo, the last known specimen died of exposure one night when the keeper forgot to let it in. The last of its kind, alone, in a cage, through negligence. Thylacine, DNA, exists. Specimens are preserved in Australian museums, including pups in alcohol jars with remarkably well-preserved genetic material. A team at the University of Melbourne has been working on its genome for years. In 2023, they announced a significant breakthrough. They had successfully activated thylacine genes within mouse cells, the first step toward developing viable embryos. The project is funded by both government and private sources. The most optimistic estimate suggests a decade. What's unsettling about the thylacine isn't the science, it's the story behind its extinction. The Australian colonial government paid bounties for every thylacine killed. They actively exterminated them because ranchers considered them a threat. Then they declared it a protected species, 2 months before the last one died. 2 months, and now we want to bring it back. There's something about that sequence that says a lot about how humans relate to nature. The third case has the most American story in the most literal sense. The passenger pigeon was, for centuries, the most abundant bird in North America. Historical records describe flocks so enormous that they darkened the sun for hours. We're talking about billions of individuals. The last one, a female named Martha, died in 1914 at the Cincinnati Zoo. Between that flock that darkened the sun and Martha alone in a cage, less than 100 years of uncontrolled industrial hunting passed. The Revive and Restore project has been working for over a decade to de-extinct the passenger pigeon, using it as a base species. They have something other projects lack: the support of environmentalists who argue that the passenger pigeon was a keystone species whose mass breeding behaviors fertilized the eastern forests of North America in a way no current species replicates. Its absence left a real functional void. This argument makes the case for bringing it back stronger than many others, but it also introduces a problem that we'll see shortly. And then there's the dodo. It's become synonymous with ineptitude, an animal that brought it upon itself by being too clumsy to survive. That's almost entirely false. The dodo evolved on Mauritius, an island with no land predators. It wasn't stupid. It was perfectly adapted to its environment. The problem is that its environment changed abruptly when humans arrived with rats, pigs, and monkeys that destroyed its nests. Extinct in less than 100 years after the first European contact. Colossal announced in 2022 that it's also working on this species. But the dodo raises the most fundamental problem of all. Its habitat no longer exists. Mauritius has been transformed for centuries. Where do you take a dodo if you create one? To a zoo? To an artificially reconstructed island? And who pays for that? The question with the dodo isn't whether it can be created. It's where it lives afterward. If this is already blowing your mind, A-like takes less than a second and tells the algorithm that this channel deserves to exist. Subscribe now, because what comes next is where things get really dark. Part 2. Why it might go wrong. So far we've talked about amazing science, stories with poetic justice, and animals that deserved a better fate. Now comes the other side of the coin. These are arguments from real biologists and ecologists, published in real journals, that the proponents of de-extinction have genuine difficulty responding to. The first problem is called the empty niche. When a species disappears, it doesn't leave a permanent void. Ecosystems reorganize. Other species fill the vacant roles, develop new behaviors, and establish new trophic relationships. The ecosystem that existed when the thylacine was the apex predator of Tasmania no longer exists. Introducing a thylacine into the current system doesn't restore anything. It introduces an alien predator into a system that was already functioning without it. The most recent example is the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone in 1995, always cited as a success story, and it is, with important nuances. The wolves changed the behavior of the elk, which avoided certain valleys, allowing vegetation to recover and rivers to stabilize. True, but there was also a collapse of coyote populations, competition with bears that affected other species, and conflicts with ranchers that continue to generate political tension decades later. And that was in an ecosystem that had only been without wolves for 80 years, not 4,000. The effects of reintroducing a megaherbivore that has been absent from the Arctic system for millennia are completely unpredictable. The second problem is one that proponents of de-extinction almost never mention in their lectures. Arctic animals frozen in permafrost have been carriers of pathogens for millennia, untouched by modern immune systems. In 2016, a child died in Siberia, and dozens of people were hospitalized due to an anthrax outbreak. The source was a reindeer carcass that had been frozen for 75 years and thawed that summer. The spores survived 75 years and remained infectious. There are frozen mammoths that are 30,000 years old. Scientists studying them take specific biosafety precautions because they don't know what they carry. An active project manipulating mammoth tissue could accelerate the reintroduction of extinct pathogens into modern animals, with unpredictable consequences. The third problem is philosophical, but has very real practical consequences. The animal that returns is not the original animal. The mammoth in Colossal is not a mammoth. It's an elephant modified with mammoth characteristics. The thylacine from the Melbourne team will not be a thylacine. The genome is only part of what makes an animal what it is. Behaviors, instincts, social needs, traditions that are culturally transmitted from generation to generation. None of that is in the DNA. A laboratory thylacine will not know how to be a thylacine because no one taught it. It will not have seen its mother hunt. It will not know how to relate to its species because there will be no others of its kind to learn from. What do you do with that animal? You can't release it because it won't survive. You can't keep it in a zoo indefinitely because that's not conservation. It's an exhibition. It's a creature without context, without community, without the millions of years of accumulated animal culture. That's not bringing it back to life. It's something different that we still don't have the words to describe. The fourth problem comes precisely from the biologists who should be most enthusiastic about de-extinction. If extinction appears reversible, the pressure to protect existing species diminishes. If you can bring the dead back, why spend billions on habitat preservation, environmental regulation, and conflicts with extractive industries? You simply let them go extinct and bring them back later. This logic is absurd from a biological perspective, but has a perverse coherence from a political and economic one. Several prominent conservation biologists have written that de-extinction is the greatest enemy of modern conservation, not because of what it does, but because of the message it sends, that extinction is not permanent, that there is always an undo button. The fifth issue touches on something we prefer not to look at directly. Colossal Biosciences is a private company with venture capital investors. It has raised over $200 million. It has obligations to its shareholders. The woolly mammoth has potentially enormous commercial value, the theme park, the tourist attraction, the patent on a living species. Because that is precisely what Colossal would be in a position to claim: technological control over the reproductive processes of these animals. In a world where the human genome has been the subject of intellectual property disputes for decades, the idea of a private company controlling the genome of a resurrected species should produce a malaise that we, as a society, are not yet processing. If you haven't liked this video yet, now's the time. And if you're not subscribed, the next video is going to slip by without you even noticing. Oh, don't let that happen, because what's coming next is the worst part. Part 3. The case no one should have proposed. And here we arrive at where I promised we'd arrive from the beginning, the reserved case, the one that makes all the previous ones seem like mere technical problems. Neanderthal DNA has been sequenced, completely. The Max Planck Institute finished sequencing the entire Neanderthal genome in 2010, using the bone of a Neanderthal woman who died in Siberia between 50,000 and 80,000 years ago. We know more about the Neanderthal genome than about many living animals. We have the data. We have the gene editing technology to work with that data. And there are scientists who have openly proposed it. The most frequently cited expert is George Church, both a Harvard geneticist and one of the most brilliant and controversial minds in modern biology, who also advises Colossal on the Mammoth project. In a 2013 interview, he stated that cloning a Neanderthal would technically be possible, requiring only an extremely brave surrogate mother. The statement caused a major uproar. Church later clarified that he wasn't proposing to do it, but rather describing a technical possibility. But the technical possibility exists, and that changes everything. Because Neanderthals are not animals. That's what makes this case entirely different. Neanderthals buried their dead with rituals. They made complex tools. They cared for their sick and elderly. Something we know because we've found skeletons of individuals with severe disabilities who survived for decades, which is only possible if someone actively cared for them. The oldest records of cave paintings in Europe date back 65,000 years, when modern humans hadn't yet arrived on the continent. They had language, almost certainly, because their anatomy allowed it and their complex social behaviors required it. And they shared 99.7% of their DNA with us. What is a Neanderthal reconstructed in the 21st century? The question has no answer within the current legal or ethical framework, because no system was designed to contemplate that possibility. Is it a person? If so, it has rights. The right not to be created without consent, which makes its very creation an ethical violation before it even exists. The right to live in community with its species, which doesn't exist. The right to a cultural identity that no one can grant because that culture has been dead for 50,000 years. Is it an experiment? If so, the bioethical principles constructed after the horrors of the 20th century explicitly prohibit experimentation on subjects who cannot consent. And the situation of a Neanderthal in 2028 would be utterly incomprehensible to it. The sole being of its species, without a history, surrounded by a different species that studies and observes it, and that can never be what it needs. There's a question philosophers have debated for centuries about the boundary between humanity and non-humanity, about what defines moral personhood, about what makes us deserving of rights. For all that time, it was an abstract debate because the intermediate candidates were extinct. If you bring back a Neanderthal, the debate ceases to be abstract, and the history of how humans treat beings we consider slightly less human than ourselves is not a story that inspires optimism. The most unsettling thing of all isn't the technical possibility. It's that the debate is already happening, not in philosophy circles, in genetics journals, at synthetic biology conferences, in companies with hundreds of millions of dollars. The speed at which technology is advancing suggests that the distance between academic discussion and real possibility is much shorter than most people realize. Neanderthals are the mirror that de-extinction holds up to us. Because when you think about mammoths, the debate is about ecosystems and patents. When you think about Neanderthals, the debate is about who we are. Science can do it. That part is already settled. At some point in the next few decades, some laboratory will create one of these animals because it can, because there's money, because humanity has repeatedly demonstrated that the question of whether it can be done is the only one that truly matters in practice. The question of whether it should be done comes later, when it's already too late to actually do it. What determines whether this ends well or in disaster is not technology. It's whether we have the collective maturity to decide when not to use what we are capable of creating. And history doesn't suggest that maturity is one of our strengths as a species. If these questions aren't asked aloud, urgently, before the first animals are born, someone will make those decisions for us in a private laboratory with obligations to its shareholders. And that is far more terrifying than any of the creatures we've discussed today. Which one would you resurrect if you could? And which one do you think is the most dangerous to bring back? Let me know in the comments because that conversation is worth having. And if this video made you think, tells the algorithm that this content deserves to reach more people, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because next time, we're going even deeper.